Please stand for the reading of the gospel. You will find it Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 23. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priest and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching, and throughout all Judea, from Galilee, where he began, even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people, and here I have examined him in your presence, and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us." This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. The word of the Lord.
You may be seated. The whole company of the Sanhedrin got up out of their seats as one body, and they took Jesus and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found that this man is perverting the nation." Now, of all things to accuse Jesus of, misleading the nation is certainly not what you would have expected. But that's what people in power do when they're trying to besmirk this person that they hate so vehemently. They arrested Jesus for the good of the nation. The leaders who conspired to set the crucifixion in motion believed that they were acting justly. There wasn't much that the Sanhedrin during that time period in history agreed upon. They were a pretty diverse group, two very much opposing camps on many things. They disagreed and argued and fussed, but they were in charge. Kind of reminds you of governments in the world today. One thing that they did agree on was if they let this Jesus person continue on, it was going to hurt their power and authority among the people. And that was really what mattered. The council was comprised of priests and scribes from two political parties, but coming together in judgment against Jesus for upsetting the status quo was something worthy of stirring the pot. Guaranteed to stir the pot. Power and privilege. They're quite addicting. 70 elders plus the high priest made up the Sanhedrin. So if you imagine a grand meeting room with the chairs single file in a half circle, that way they could overwhelm the person that was coming to stand before them by that vastness of how they just look so physically imposing. 70 all circled around. They wanted to be able to see each other's faces too and achieve maximum intimidation. As they began to voice their political smears against Jesus of Nazareth, they felt their own energy just grow. Oh, they were getting drunk on that feeling. They felt the determination in the room crescendo until they just rose to their feet as one body, determined to make this thing happen, ready to kill him. Religion and politics were very much fused in Israel in the time of Jesus. The most esteemed religious writings were, after all, called the law. Therefore, the law and religion were definitely tied up together. There was no separation of church and state, even though both the synagogue and the state were under Roman authority at that time. They were an occupied people with Romans in power under the rule of the empire. But yet, within their own realm, they had power and privilege. They were priestly politicians, and they conspired and engineered that plan to put Jesus to death. It's so easy and yet so dangerous to stir up political fervor, whip the crowds into a frenzy. Believe in the righteousness of your cause. How many times have we seen that to be true throughout history? The negative energy of human nature especially rallies when someone gets that 2 or 3 word rallying cry going, and the people repeat it and repeat it louder so that everybody is shouting that cry. Label the other guy the troublemaker. Accuse him of stirring up trouble, perverting the nation, all the while whipping up the crowd, telling them that their basic values and their way of life are about to be destroyed if they don't stand up and do something now. So they paint the enemy as a blasphemer against God and everything holy. A planted ringleader shouted, "Crucify him." And then other voices took up the chant, "Crucify him, yes, crucify him." Until all the people were shouting, "Crucify." And they would not let up. Every religiously devoted shout for crucifixion came from a person who believed that they were doing the right thing for the sake of the nation, God and country. So don't think that in the same situation that we might not also be the ones to get caught up in God and country. It's not meant to blame others. The narrative is meant to step on toes extremely hard and to pierce all the way to the heart and soul of the matter. They thought they were doing the right thing for the sake of God and country, killing Jesus. How did things get so skewed? And why does it seem so uncomfortably familiar? Political games spawn some interesting friendships. Verse 12 says that same day, Herod and Pilate became friends. They bonded over this day. Isn't that nice? They had been enemies before, just both despicable human beings. But after this day, they thought each other was okay. They passed Jesus back and forth between them. "Oh, it's your jurisdiction. Oh, no, it's yours, please." Now, Herod had been wanting to see this fellow for a long time. He'd heard about Jesus. And they didn't have TV, and this was really good theater. He was hoping that Jesus might even perform a miracle. Wouldn't that be cool? And so Herod ordered the popcorn, and he started tormenting Jesus. If he questioned him long and hard enough, would he do something to make things just go away? Would he disappear? He had heard that Jesus did that before. Just kind of disappeared. Well, maybe he'll do that if I just press him hard enough. But Jesus wouldn't play the game. He refused to answer. He just stood there serenely, zen-like. Well, that was no fun. They poked him and prodded him, and Jesus didn't do anything. Herod had his soldiers treat Jesus with absolute contempt, spit on him. Nothing. Mock him. Nothing. You couldn't even make this guy mad. Herod put an elegant robe on him. Oh, if he's the king, give him a robe. Let him look the part. And sent him back to Pilate. "I'm tired of him. You play with him now." And Pilate was an atrocious leader who oftentimes did play with his food. And he decided to make a game of it, a contest of wills. So he got this other guy to stand up on the platform, Barabbas. Now, he had been arrested for insurrection against the Roman Empire, which the people might have been a little bit, happy about. But, if you want to please Pilate, vote for this guy to be killed. After all, he had murdered Roman soldiers during that insurrection. Surely the people would want to please Pilate, but he overplayed his hand. They shouted to free Barabbas. And they kept up with their horrible, ugly demand to crucify Jesus. And Pilate said, "Oh, come on now, 2 out of 3. Pilate played 3 rounds of that awful game. Who do you want to free? Who do you want to crucify? And Jesus lost that game 3 times by the prevailing voice of the people that kept crying, "Crucify him." Negative, hateful evil on steroids prevailed. God forgive us when we let animosity prevail. When we feed it and stoke it and allow it to have power to set up permanent residence in our minds. Beware of the prevailing voices of negativity in this world. Don't let them become a part of the way you think, breathe, and live. What is the prevailing voice in your head today? Is it the voice of a family member who abandoned or rejected you, belittled and tormented you? Is it the voice of coworkers and friends who set the stage and draw the lines of how conversations should go and who we should make fun of and who is the enemy of the moment? Is it the prevailing voice found on Facebook and Twitter feeds? Are you actively Googling hateful things? Is the prevailing voice in your life a news channel or a website? It's for entertainment purposes only. Really? Because it matters immensely to your soul what you feed it. It shapes your heart and your will. And even when you feel at your most self-righteous, you can do so much hurt. On the contrary, when you make your home inside the love of Jesus Christ, you will set the voice of God and the witness of His Spirit as the prevailing voice that you hear. The prevailing voice in your life, in your thoughts, in your heart. Christ is the only solid ground out there. All other things are sinking sand. If your prevailing voice is anything other than God, get right with the Lord. The Christian life bears remarkable resemblance to the passion of Luke in chapter 23. It is a contest of wills, strong wills and prevailing voices. It's a wrestling with what we will allow to have power in our lives, to take the privileged place of our thought processes, even of our entertainment. Matt Skinner says that Luke offers this political drama to show how truth and justice got overwhelmed by that strong will to reject Jesus. And the will of Pilate and Herod to play games and be entertained. And even though Pilate watched with horror as it all ended badly, he washed his hands. Political games often end badly. Political games played by Christians end badly. Beware the cost of admission. The spiritual drama of the story is that God's will, incredibly, in spite all of those horrible, oh my gosh, so awful, reprehensible acts of humans, in spite of all that, God's will in the path of salvation just kept moving forward. The height of goodness was there in the most despicable of moments of human evil. All of those actions of not just the elite, but everyday people. No matter how in control people's voices around us seem, God will not be ultimately thwarted. And although we know that the cross is a very significant part of the Christian story, the cross was a very temporary time in that week. The story has a much better ending. But that moment was gruesome. And it showed us so much about ourselves. Jesus' rejection is messy. And it's oftentimes the religious who exhibit the worst behavior. God knows how we get caught up sometimes in the reprehensible. You can't fix the passion story to make it palatable. It's just an awful thing. And the mirror is hard to look through. Sometimes people are awful and their prevailing voices can haunt you for a lifetime. The pain and the suffering is unimaginable. Yet, in the midst of that awful day, God's design for saving the world kept moving forward. God's saving will wasn't thwarted by the schemes of politicians or their rabid crowds. God's resurrection will was accomplished, and eternal life won forever. Jesus' resurrection will one day mean the end to all earthly kingdoms. All worldly power struggles and oppressions will cease. One day, all of the redeemed will be free by the power of God because that is God's will. The prevailing voices do not have the last word because the voice of God speaks louder. That all-created voice calls forth resurrection life. God's voice is the only voice that will ultimately